The agency was created in 1957 after some very complex and difficult negotiations. Its history spans the Cold War, the post-Cold War era, and the emergence of what some believe is the end of the post-Cold War era. The IAEA's 60-year history is a story of vision, statesmanship, international cooperation, institution building and progress, creating, at least in the areas of its primary missions, safeguards and the promotion of peaceful use of nuclear energy, an indispensable agency. But it's also a story of technical adaptation and political evolution in the face of continuous and continuing challenges, even crises, technical, institutional, and political. It's clear to me that the challenges the IAEA will continue, and the agency will need to evolve in the future as it's evolved over the last 6 decades. As we look over those last 6 decades, we're very, very fortunate today to have the opportunity to hear perspectives from individuals who have interacted with the agency at critical times in that period and have indeed helped shape the history of the agency. We'll start with Ambassador James Goodby, the Annenberg Distinguished Visiting Fellow at Stanford's Hoover Institution. He served in the U.S. Foreign Service, achieving the rank of career minister, and was appointed to 5 ambassadorial rank positions by Presidents Carter, Reagan, and Clinton, including Ambassador to Finland. During his foreign service career, he was involved as a negotiator and policy advisor in the creation of the International Atomic Energy Agency, the negotiation of the Limited Test Ban Treaty, START, the Conference on Disarmament in Europe, and Nunn-Lugar Cooperative Threat Reduction Program. He's the author and editor of several books. His most recent is Deterrence, Its Past and Future, edited with George Schultz and Sidney Drell. Ambassador Goodby.
Thank you very much, Joe. I'm very glad to be here, and thank you very much for inviting me. I have to differ with you just on a couple of points. It's related mainly to when was the actual birth of the IAEA. And from my perspective, it actually happened in 1956, not in 1957. And I'll explain that by saying, of course, I was personally involved in 1956, so therefore. But the point of that is to say that there were tremendously important issues that were discussed in the working level meeting on the draft statute of the Atomic Energy Agency, which were held here in Washington in February through April of 1956. Those meetings were chaired for the U.S. side by a man named James Wadsworth, Jerry Wadsworth, who happened to be a descendant of George Washington's quartermaster general, and who was a man who understood conciliation and how to compromise. Had he not been in charge, had the attitude that we took in 1956 been similar to that which we took later on, which is rather an America First attitude, I'm not sure that the IAEA would have materialized at that particular point, probably would have later on. Wadsworth was able to see that there were points of view expressed by the nations represented, in particular India, that had to be accommodated in some way. Homi J. Bhabha was the representative of India at that time. He took a very, very, I would say, fierce line about Indian independence, about lack of interest in safeguards that would limit what India chose to do. And under a lesser man than James Wadsworth, I suspect there could have been an impasse very easily at that point. Zarubin, the Soviet ambassador to Washington, was the Soviet representative in these talks, and he took a surprisingly conciliatory line. Not altogether, but enough so that between the United States and the Soviet Union, there was quite a bit of momentum towards solving these issues that came up. I was there in that meeting, not as a representative of the United States, but as a so-called technical secretary. The meeting was organized by the Department of State and was held in the Department of State Conference Center. And there were 3 or 4 secretaries, so-called, who basically had the job of trying to keep the things going and make the trains run on time, and in my case, take notes and help out the people around the table. Therefore, I sat next to the chair, next to James Wadsworth, and had a good view down the room of all these people. And to me, they became people, that is to say, individuals with their own idiosyncrasies, and not as representatives of nations. I suspect that kind of atmosphere crept into those talks. I would mention in particular Homi J. Bhabha, who sat on my right side, I think, and he always began the day by offering me a glass of water. And I remember that to this day, so you see how important it is to indulge younger officials, because they remember you later on. In any case, it was, in my mind, the threshold that brought the IAEA to the point where it became a reality. After that, in 1957, I think Eisenhower was very pleased that it was taking place, that it was going to actually occur. I'll come back to that a bit later. I don't think he had too much interest at that point in what it would actually do. It had changed quite a bit, as you know, since the 1953 speech. And so therefore, what happened was that the Joint Committee on Atomic Energy, which was a very powerful group, the Joint Committee on Atomic Energy meant that the House and the Senate jointly chaired a shared chairmanship of this committee, which controlled the funds and policies and was pretty much all powerful. I say that because I became a member of the staff of the Atomic Energy Commission in June of 1954 and had worked at the AEC 2 years by the time the meeting on the IAEA took place. I had not spent a lot of time on thinking about the IAEA, but I had been working with a couple of people who had, namely a man named Spofford G. English, a very good friend of mine, who became involved in the technical talks that between the United States and Russia about how to put markers into uranium and try to monitor it that way. And I also had some dealings with one of the attorneys in the AEC named, we called him Moose Eisenberg, who was actually the author, as far as I knew, of the draft statute. He later on asked me if I would do a legislative history of the working level meetings on the draft statute, which I agreed to do, but it took me months and months, and the result was not very happy from my perspective. But you can find it out in the National Archives, even today, if you want to know blow by blow what actually happened. I was involved in the follow-on to some extent of that working level meeting, because there was quite a bit of debate in the AEC and elsewhere in Washington about just what it would do now that we more or less had it in hand. And my attitude was that it should become a center of scientific excellence. I felt if it did that, it would gain strength and power, it would absorb a lot of these issues. And if it did not do that, it would not do the job it was capable of doing. That at that time came to naught. A few of us were encouraged to go up to New York and talk with the man who was designated to be the first U.S. representative in the Board of Governors, whose name was Robert McKinney. Now, McKinney was an ally of Clinton P. Anderson, Anderson being a senator from New Mexico, who at various points was the chair of the Joint Committee on Atomic Energy, and therefore a very powerful man. The attitude that McKinney had, shared by Anderson, was that we needed to promote the peaceful uses of atomic energy, that is nuclear reactors, and that the government should pay for it. That had been an issue for 2 or 3 years prior to that, with some saying, well, we shouldn't really promote it. If it's economically feasible, fine, let's do it. If not, we'll just not push very far into that area. Clinton P. Anderson helped to organize a panel chaired by Robert McKinney, and that panel came to the conclusion that Anderson wanted, which was that we needed to put a lot of money and resources into developing the civil uses of atomic energy through reactors. So when McKinney was appointed to be the head of the U.S. delegation, some of us were invited to go up and talk with him to see if we should go along with him to Vienna, which I really wanted to do that at the time. And we were asked to bring papers along to tell him what we thought ought to be done with the IAEA, and so I wrote a paper about my idea about scientific excellence. And I met him, I think it was on a Sunday, in his apartment on Park Avenue in Manhattan, and gave him my paper. We had a brief discussion. Needless to say, we didn't get very far. He was making cracks about bureaucrats working on weekends, and that kind of turned me off too. So I didn't get the job, and for a time I don't think the emphasis on science was as strong as it should have been. Now it clearly is, as you heard from the Director General, doing all kinds of things in science, and I think that is attracting business, if you will, to the IAEA, which I think is exactly right. I'll talk about another episode in which I was involved because, as Joe said, I was in and out of the IAEA. I didn't spend a career working on it, but I was there at some critical moments. And another one that I think of as the coming of age of the IAEA occurred when I was the first secretary in the U.S. mission to the European communities, as it was called then, which consisted of 6 countries struggling for an identity and wondering what to do about Euratom. The Euratom was their atomic energy arm of the communities. And my job, of course, having some nuclear background, was to follow Euratom. So I got to know some of the people very well early on. And one of them I liked and had a lot to do with, a man named Enrico Iacchia, who was a Venetian, and the term fine Italian hand really suited him. He understood how diplomacy works and how you reach agreements and so forth. So there was, at that time, early in my time there, a fierce struggle going on really within the European communities about whether they needed to preserve the possibility of not only a civil nuclear option independently run by them, or whether they should in fact preserve the option of a nuclear capability, nuclear weapons capability. And that was, of course, the reason that in Washington for several years we sponsored something called the Multilateral Force, which was something that was not widely liked very much in Washington, but for some reason or other it kept on going for some time because it had the potential of developing into a kind of multilateral nuclear armed group, which would take care of Germany and other countries' desires for some kind of participation in the nuclear deterrence. So there was still an issue, in other words, by the mid-1960s about whether they should really sign on to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which had gained quite a bit of momentum over the years, and it was pretty close to being fully accepted when I got there to the European Communities headquarters. In any case, there was a disagreement about whether the IAEA should be allowed to inspect the facilities of the members of the Euratom group. And they were saying, we won't take on this obligation at all. We won't join this NPT. Well, Yakia and I talked about it and wanted to solve it, and the way we did solve it, I think it was probably Yakia as much as anybody, not me probably, but the idea was to have the Euratom Safeguards Agency, of which he was the head, inspect the facilities of the Euratom countries, and the IAEA would basically inspect the Euratom Safeguards Agency to make sure it was doing the right thing. And so that is the way it worked out, at least at that stage. And that's the proposal we sent in to Washington, and I guess Enrico sent it on to the EC. We were both in Brussels at the time. And that was accepted. And that, so far as I know, was probably the last breakthrough that enabled the Europeans to sign on to the NPT. So I call that coming of age, because that enabled the IAEA to have a powerful role in Europe as well as in other countries, and also brought, of course, IAEA fully into the idea of its role beyond that of promoting nuclear reactors. It had now an important role in safeguards, which to my mind opened the door to many, many other things that could be done and are being done by the IAEA. And now let me just say a few things about Eisenhower. Eisenhower, I think very early on, before he became president, was influenced by ideas that he picked up from discussions. He was actually, as you know, was the Supreme Commander Allied powers in Europe during World War II. He knew a lot of people, including a lot of Soviets. And he became convinced, and this is documented, that nuclear weapons could prevent war. They would be so terrible that nuclear weapons would make it, would basically abolish war. That was his thinking. But to do that, you had to make it credible that you would actually use a nuclear weapon in combat, and of course that led to some problems. But he, I think, in '53, his first year in office, he was intent on setting up that idea as part of his administration strategy. And you probably all know about how he resolved the issue about what strategy to use by getting various people together to advocate rollback or containment or various other ideas, and settled clearly on containment, and settled on nuclear deterrence as a way to enforce containment, one of the methods anyway. So in '53, when he gave that speech at the end of that year, I think he had pretty much consolidated the idea that nuclear weapons would be the major deterrent of our country, of this country. And the speech, and to my mind, the way I read it, it was aimed at creating the idea that war really is impossible because it's so horrible. I mean, he didn't hide anything about what nuclear weapons would do to humanity, and that's what that speech was about. And he made that speech in various forms on other occasions as well. So that was part of his strategy, make clear that if we ever did revert to use nuclear weapons, that this would be an ultimate catastrophe for humanity. So that was part of it, and the idea of cooperation among nations was the other part of it. And he saw that nuclear weapons could be, nuclear capabilities rather, could be a way of doing that. So to my mind, the speech did two things. It said war is a terrible thing, but we can cooperate. We need to keep nuclear capabilities up front. Because, you know, they were worried in those days that the United States public would resist being prepared for war at a moment's notice. We'd never been in that position in all our history. Very few countries had been. But now we had to be prepared at any moment for a war that could break out through surprise attack, which is, again, one of his great concerns. So the speech didn't go anywhere for a while. Everybody sort of liked it. Russians are fairly skeptical. But by '56, it became clear that there was enough momentum behind it so it could make some headway. But in '56, Eisenhower had a whole different view of what his job was. And his view was he needed to try to take advantage of the change in leadership in Moscow. Stalin died in March of 1953, and there was still some residual back and forth about who was going to run the Soviet Union from then on, and even in '56. So he, from '56 on, you look at what he did, and it's really an amazing record of trying to reach agreements with the Russians and others. '56 saw not only the working level meeting, but also the establishment of a UN study on the effects on humanity, on people, of ionizing radiation. In other words, acknowledging that there was a fallout problem, which the AEC, my employer, had been resisting for quite a long time. So that was done, and it still exists in some form today. In '57, there was a 6-month-long conference in London, which came very close to reaching some agreements. Harold Stassen was the head of the delegation. I happened to be there also as AEC representative, and I was known for saying strontium-90 is good for you. So, so we managed to get through the '57 and with pretty good results, in fact, in establishing a relationship between the management in Moscow and Washington. '58, Eisenhower proposed 2 conferences. One was on surprise attack, and one was on a nuclear test ban. I was a member of the U.S. delegation to the Surprise Attack Conference. It didn't go anywhere, but it did spawn a whole host of studies and people in the United States interested in arms control. It kind of was the foundation of the whole arms control movement in the United States, even though it didn't reach any agreements. The '58 conference on the test ban, of course, did result in what they call the Geneva System for the monitoring of nuclear testing. And for the rest of his term in office, from '58 on through the end of 1960, Eisenhower pushed the nuclear test ban, not as vigorously as I would have liked and others would have liked, but he kept it alive through a whole series of problems. And when he left office in 1960, I think you could say that he came very, very close to reaching an agreement on a comprehensive test ban treaty of some sort. And the reason he failed was because of the shoot down of the U-2 in 1960, so that a summit meeting, which I think would have resulted in some kind of a movement towards test ban, and probably an Eisenhower visit to Russia, to the Soviet Union, collapsed for well-known reasons. Don't need to go into that. In any case, the Eisenhower of the late 1950s was on a somewhat different tangent area of interest than the earlier on. So I think perhaps I can stop there. I have a lot of other things I would like to say, but I'm going to have to give way to my colleagues.
Thank you, Ambassador. Our next speaker is Myron Kratzer, who joined the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission's Division of International Affairs in 1957. As Director of International Affairs and Assistant General Manager for International Activities, he negotiated numerous agreements for cooperation in the peaceful use of nuclear energy. He was the principal U.S. negotiator of the IAEA Safeguards Documents, Information Circulars, or INFCIRCs, 26, 66, and 153, which was the NPT Safeguards document. He participated in the negotiations of the safeguards provisions for the NPT that created 153. He joined the Department of State in 1971, served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Nuclear Affairs from 1975 to 1977. He left government service in 1977, but continued as a consultant in nonproliferation and safeguards policy. he has written, spoken, and testified widely on the development and importance of international safeguards, emphasizing the essentiality of strong and effective safeguards to widespread application of nuclear energy to electrical power generation. Myron.
Thanks very much, Joe. I do want to thank you for having me here. I admire your courage in having a very senior citizen part of your group. Just one point. What is our subject?
1956.
It's your life, Myron.
I spent quite a bit of time in getting some things together for this presentation and trying to find a way to avoid beginning with a reference to Eisenhower's address. And I now know that there's a very simple answer to that, and that is to not be the first speaker. But just to vary the pitch a little bit, I'll concentrate in referencing his speech not on what he said, but on what he didn't say, because it's really kind of interesting. First of all, he made no mention at all of the concept that was built into the immediate post-war review of atomic energy and how to control it. What ended up as the Baruch Plan of international ownership of so-called sensitive or dangerous activities such as reprocessing or enrichment that provide immediate access to weapons usable material. He didn't mention it. And yet that was at the time and when it was first floated, and to some extent continuing from that time onward, the kind of the gold standard of many people in the non-proliferation community. I think Eisenhower did us a great favor by omitting it, because I think there are a lot of problems with international ownership of these facilities that haven't really been explored. But my recollection, and it's interesting that Jim saw it from the inside, I saw it pretty much from the outside, is that the impact of the speech was dramatic. Eisenhower generally conceded to be, I think, his most important foreign policy address. And the enthusiasm was widespread. It was all over the world. I have always felt, maybe Jim has a different view of it, that the Soviet Union went along with it because there was no alternative. So many countries were on board that they had no way of escaping it. To put this into a little bit of context, when I look at the age levels, and there's several represented here in the audience, I don't think many of you have a feeling for the stature of atomic energy at the time. Atomic energy was the space program, which didn't exist, the digital revolution, which didn't exist, all rolled into one. It had recently, in the view of most of us, ended the war. There was no really competition for big science and the role of science in our progress. And it was important to do something about what was going to become of atomic energy. And in addition to that, it was built into the Atomic Energy Act of 1946 that in due course the Congress, and by implication the administration, would have to consider what to do about peaceful uses of atomic energy. If I can find the button, I will press it. That seems to have turned it off, which is probably, this is not the, you know, in order for those things to become a reality, what the Eisenhower address, under our system, it required legislation, and that became the Atomic Energy Act of 1946, or 1954 rather, replacing the 1946 Act. And there are several things that strike me about it. First of all, By today's standards, the speed of doing it was remarkable. Eisenhower spoke in December of '53, and by August of '54, the Atomic Energy Act of 1954 had come into being. It was not the Eisenhower plan by any means. It was much broader. It focused, for example, on bilateral types of cooperation. I'm not sure that even that the Atomic Energy Organization, which Eisenhower essentially named in his address, was even mentioned in the legislation. Verification got a very light touch. The word verification didn't appear. I think the word safeguards may have appeared once or twice. But the idea was that countries who were being helped by our output of atomic energy materials and information would have to agree to accept some sort of safeguards, and the word safeguards did appear, but there was no indication whatsoever of what these would consist of. And then the last two items were important. The statute developed a fairly complicated regime for undertaking cooperation with other countries, built around what were called agreements for cooperation. And the thing that was maybe not unique about them, but certainly unique to the atomic energy field, was that these were subject to congressional review before coming into existence. And the Joint Committee on Atomic Energy that Jim mentioned, and which, as many of us know from bitter experience, was a very powerful group, had the authority to keep these from coming into being. They never did defeat one of our many 40-odd agreements for cooperation, but merely having that power gave them a tremendous authority over what was in the agreements, who to deal with, and how to deal with them. The Joint Committee on Atomic Energy, which again Jim has mentioned as a powerful group, built on that and by other provisions of the statute, for example, the famous provision keeping them currently and fully informed, to exercise a very detailed oversight, and I think that understates what they really did. They were, in effect, another administrative body running the atomic energy programs of the United States through their power as a congressional joint committee. But when you look at these two events in total, first the Eisenhower speech, secondly the revised legislation, the thing that stands out in my mind today is that neither of them mentioned the possibility of non-proliferation. The word didn't appear, and these were not non-proliferation agreements. These were not non-proliferation documents. Any country who accepted the bilateral help of the United States or other bilateral suppliers, and there were others, or the help of the International Atomic Energy Agency, was completely free to go its own way, or the help of others who also were receiving help to develop nuclear weapons capabilities if they chose to do so. Now, how did that come about, and why didn't people raise all kinds of dickens about it? Well, I have a Moose Eisenberg story too, Jim. To my recollection, there was only one voice in the entire Atomic Energy Commission who did raise quite a bit of heck about that, and that was Moose Eisenberg. He was adamant that this was no way to go, but nobody listened to him. The fact is that I think the built-in attitude at the time was that our help would be so attractive, our materials would be of such great help, that countries would simply choose to go that way, so that there would be a non-proliferation outcome in effect without requiring it as a legal obligation. And of course, as years went by, more and more people began to be very unhappy about that, and leading to comments such as the mindless Atoms for Peace program and the like. Now, what the Atomic Energy Act of '46 did, and it did it to a fairly well, was establish several alternative ways to cooperate internationally in atomic energy, and these in effect became quite competitive. First of all, there was a bilateral route, and the thing that was critical in the bilateral route, in other words, U.S. Cooperation with a single other country, the thing that was critical was that it was available immediately. The legislation was passed in '54. The IAEA didn't come into being until '57, and in that interim, the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission, my colleagues, and to a limited extent myself, were out beating the bushes to sign up countries for bilateral cooperation. And we did it first by these little tiny research reactor agreements under which we could transfer a research reactor and one fuel loading of its fuel requirements, limited at 20% enrichment, and that would have to be returned until they got a second loading. Well, of course, that was never, or not until much, much later, that was really not followed. They did get duplicate loadings of 20% material, and not too long afterwards, they got, under a much more detailed agreement, the opportunity to get higher enriched material all the way up to 90%. Now, within a short time after the research reactor agreement era, we began to negotiate so-called comprehensive agreements for cooperation, which allowed material in much greater quantities, largely low-enriched uranium, but still up to 20% if desired. We got agreements with many countries who were immediately interested in nuclear power. And my recollection, it may be mistaken, is that the first one of those came into being in '56, again, long before the Atomic Energy Commission, the International Atomic Energy Agency, was open for business. Now, the interesting thing about those comprehensive bilateral agreements is that the safeguards agreements, the safeguards provisions of those agreements were almost word for word identical to the safeguard language of the IAEA statute. Now, that was not a coincidence, obviously couldn't be. The simple answer was the same people wrote them. And I think that was colleagues of yours that you mentioned, including Wadsworth and his colleagues. And if you haven't read Article 12C, and by implication or by comparison, the same language in our bilateral agreements, if you haven't read Article 12, the Safeguards Article of the IAEA statute, and especially I think it's 12-6, 12, and the first sentence of that, you really ought to, everybody in this room should read it because it's dramatic language. I'm sure it had never appeared in any international agreement up till then, and it said that inspectors of the agency, or in the bilateral case, inspectors of the United States, and we had an inspectorate, shall have the right of access at all times to all places. Now, there's a little difference here. The IAEA statute says to persons, whereas the bilateral agreement language omitted the persons. But there was a very important distinction in the preliminary language, in the preambular language of the Safeguards Article. In the IAEA statute, and this caused us a lot of trouble, it said to the extent relevant to the agreement that you were safeguarding, that was absent in the bilateral agreements. And if we had a bilateral agreement with a country and supplied them anything, any nuclear material, any nuclear facilities, any significant part of a nuclear facility, we had these dramatic rights of access, and we used them. And if anyone had said to us, well, we don't think you ought to come that often or what have you, we would simply have dismissed it because we had the rights that we wanted, and we exercised them. Now, I've listed there several other organizations Euratom was critical. Euratom was from the standpoint of safeguards and nonproliferation, for us, a unique organization. For the first and only time, we delegated safeguards authority. And incidentally, the word safeguards, I think, was an unfortunate mistake. We're talking about verification. Safeguards, to me, doesn't convey the same amount of information as the word verification. We delegated that authority to Euratom as an organization. And that created difficulties that, to some extent, have never been entirely dissipated. There were many countries, of course the Soviet Union in particular, but not them alone, who regarded the safeguard activities of Euratom as self-inspection. We rejected that. From our point of view, and I still believe it was correct, from our point of view, the Euratom as an organization, and incidentally there were only 6 members in those days, was a bona fide international organization in which several of the member countries had genuine adverse interest about the acquisition of nuclear weapons by any of their partners in the organization. And that's a critical difference between, for example, the Asiatom that was discussed today by the Director General and Euratom. You could have a similar organization in Asia, but you'd have to be very careful that there was an adversity of interest built in among the members to make their verification system, if that's what they had, a legitimate one. I'm not going to bother now because there's not enough time with the European Nuclear Energy Agency. It was small, but they got a lot done. And one of the things they had done was to have a director who later became Safeguards Director General of the IAEA, Rudolf Romich, who I feel was one of the most impressive of the many able Director Generals for Safeguards of the IAEA. The Geneva conferences weren't an organization as such, but they were immensely important because they opened the door to international cooperation. They were the driving force for declassification, which was an essential element in all of this. You couldn't have a serious international cooperation program on a confidential or classified basis. And they opened the door to something that may surprise some of you. There was to competition, international competition. We were the big dogs in nuclear energy, but we weren't alone by 1956. The big difference is that the British and the French were also developing nuclear energy for peaceful purposes, for nuclear power. And it may come as a surprise to some of you that the 2 first nuclear power plants sold in international commerce were not American nuclear plants. They were British graphite-moderated, natural uranium nuclear power plants, one to Italy and one to Japan. And we were unhappy with that because we wanted other countries to have nuclear power, but we wanted them to have U.S. nuclear power. Why? Well, first of all, the obvious commercial reasons. We wanted that business. But more importantly than that, and it was more important, was we wanted to have nuclear power of the U.S. variety based on the use of light water reactors and low enriched uranium as the fuel supply, because we were the sole supplier for all practical purposes in the Western world of light enriched uranium. Our enrichment plants were already large and getting larger by the year. And we felt that that was the critical ingredient to using nuclear power as a door opener to getting effective controls in the form of verification or safeguards over other countries pursuing nuclear energy for peaceful purposes. Works better in this direction. Now, what was happening in Vienna? Well, Vienna, as has already been mentioned, the IAEA had 2 important roles. One of them was safeguards. but they weren't ready to apply safeguards. That took a lot of work, and we ran into something, and this is the importance of those magic words to the extent relevant. We ran into the problem that countries, even though they had signed and become parties to the statute, were not prepared to accept IAEA safeguards without further detail on exactly what would happen to them. This was not happening in the bilateral world, and we were unhappy with the necessity of detailing how the safeguards would be applied to member states of the IAEA accepting it. We came up with what we thought was a brilliant solution, and I think by and large it did the job, and that was to approach safeguards on a stepwise basis. We would first come up with detailed arrangements, a safeguard system, so to speak, for the most trivial, the smallest units that were being used in international commerce, these research reactors, usually only 5 megawatts power level or even less. And as the need arose, we would extend that to more larger and more complex and more proliferation problematic activities. In the case of the bilaterals and Euratom, as I mentioned, we delegated to Euratom, to the great surprise of our partners, the safeguards responsibility. We retained a very minor role of visiting each other's safeguard headquarters, but we did not have any rights of access via our agreement for cooperation with Euratom to their activities. Finally, around that time, I think 1961 probably was the original one, we came up with the idea of allowing the IAEA to inspect several selected facilities in the United States, the voluntary offers, and we thought that was very helpful. The ostensible reason was to demonstrate to the rest of the world that we were ready to accept the same problems, inconveniences, if they existed, that we were asking them to accept. But in addition, that was a valid reason, but in addition to that, we wanted to see whether the IAEA was doing a good job, and the best way to do that was to allow them to inspect some U.S. facilities. If I'm lucky, I'll press the right button. Now, the Eisenhower speech was very heavily oriented toward the materials supply function, and that was based on the proposition that enriched uranium, which obviously was going to be the key material of international cooperation, was a scarce commodity that would be in tight supply. Military applications obviously had the highest priority. There was an annual presidential determination of the amounts of material that would be available for peaceful uses, and those showed that it was indeed a tight supply situation. That turned out to be, in a very small period of time, completely mistaken. We had, I won't say coming out of our ears, although that came later, but we had plenty of enriched uranium. Nobody was turned down. And that was a key point, because if you give an organization the right to distribute and allocate a scarce community, that's a substantive job of some intellectual importance. If you give them the right to distribute material that is is abundant, then it's just paper pushing. And nobody wanted to get their enriched uranium from the IAEA because it just added complexity, possible costs, and so on. And there was a linkage. From our point of view, the importance of getting countries to get their material from the IAEA was this linkage between material supply and safeguards. If they got their material from the IAEA or any other significant contribution to their program, such as a reactor, they had to accept IAEA safeguards. That was the door to getting them to accept safeguards. If they got it from us, they had to accept safeguards, but only our safeguards, the bilateral ones. And this was widely attacked because by the early 60s, we had, I think, 30-odd these bilateral agreements in effect. We were getting all the safeguard responsibilities. The IAEA was getting almost none. Japan voluntarily was the first and only country of consequence to accept IAEA safeguards. But the problem was that they weren't getting their material, so they had no obligation to accept safeguards. And we came up with a plan, and I think it was sort of a breakthrough, to break that linkage from the U.S. point of view and to say to countries, you can continue to get your material bilaterally, which is your desire, but to get it bilaterally, you have to accept not our safeguards, but the safeguards of the IAEA. And that really opened the door to IAEA safeguards. And the first test case to arise under that policy was with India for their first reactor, the power reactor called Tarapur. And it was widely believed that we wouldn't be able to maintain our policy. The Indians had an intense dislike, and I'm sure you remember that, Jim. And I have a homely Bobby story too, but it's not as good as yours. He didn't pass me anything water.
Heavy water.
Well, that's a point. That's a very good point. The Indians did resist, as we knew they would, and the Joint Committee was looking down our throats with in great detail. It took us over a year to negotiate the bilateral agreement with India, and it did require, it did follow the policy. They would get the reactor from the U.S., they would get the fuel material, low-enriched uranium from the U.S., but they had to accept IAEA safeguards. And there was, I think, a delay of maybe 6 months or a year before they had to do it. I can't remember the details. But there was widespread agreement or widespread concern, especially in the Joint Committee, that we would never hold them to their word and keep their feet to the fire, and they did. We did do so. And that really put the concept of the separation of material supply and safeguards up front. To enforce it, we went from country to country. We pulled together a thing called the London Suppliers Group. It was a very strange thing. It met in the American Embassy in London. No, it met in one of the British Foreign Office's offices in London with an American chairman, who most of the time was Harry Smythe, our representative to the IAEA, and a British secretary. They're pretty good with the English language, and they do a beautiful job of much better than I can do, of pulling all this together in concise terms. And we came up with something called the trigger list of things that if any country supplied, any country who was a party to this London Suppliers Group, obviously we had no authority over anyone else, any country of the group who supplied any of these items, and the items were all the key nuclear materials, of course, low-enriched uranium or any enrichment of uranium, plutonium, heavy water, and many items, not just full reactors, but the key components, control rod drive mechanisms, pressure vessels, the like. Any country that supplied any of these items to any other country would be required, as we were ourselves doing on our own behalf, IAEA safeguards. Now, obviously, by that time, the NPT was under negotiation in Geneva, and to the extent that countries became parties to the NPT, the supplier group requirement would be met automatically. In other words, any nuclear material that they received or managed to produce or reprocess would be subject to IAEA safeguards. But the suppliers group was a very effective intermediate measure to try to bring this whole thing together, with IAEA safeguards having the preeminent role that we wanted them to have and which they have today. I've already mentioned that material became highly abundant, so I will skip the next thing, and then I'm going to skip many of these. And now we come now to what I have referred to here as the modern era of the NPT and beyond, because the NPT was negotiated. The Euratom program that Jim referred to, the Euratom attitude that Jim referred to, almost sunk the NPT in terms of safeguards. There was a period of time, I don't know if you recall this, Jim, that there was a very serious movement in the United States government, and surprisingly it was in ACTA itself, Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, to have an unsafeguarded NPT. I remember several meetings that took place to discuss this, and after one of them I came back quite elated that that was not going to fly, and that it was again going to be safeguarded by the IAEA. A few days ago, a colleague who's here in the audience said, well, he heard from another person that this other person brought that result about. And so I thought I had, but that's the way it goes. Safeguards were revived, and the solution that Jim referred to, and as it was seen in Washington, was primarily an invention of somebody on the Joint Committee. Do you remember that, Jim? Who came up with the idea that in very few words, and you'll find them in the treaty, that said the IAEA could enter into agreements with countries or with groups of countries. And of course, the group of countries that they had in mind was Euratom, and that broke the ice and led the IAEA safeguarded NPT become ratified and brought into force. That had a requirement of IAEA safeguards, and one of the interesting things about it is that the many countries, and the Europeans in particular, Euratom, felt very, very strongly, and this was headed by Germany, that the treaty would be acceptable only if the safeguard system was reviewed. And of course, the implication was very plain that the safeguard system would be reviewed and weakened or made more acceptable to them as countries that would become subject to the safeguards. The Germans in particular were, I think, genuinely concerned about safeguards on two scores. First of all, that their technology, which they felt very strongly about, would be adversely affected. In other words, there would be leakage through inspectors to countries who didn't have any right to it. And secondly, that there would be interference with their atomic energy activities, or peaceful atomic energy activities, by the inspection process. And they were determined to get the safeguards, maybe not weakened, but modified to a degree that would make them acceptable to them. And one of their targets was the so-called strategic points. Well, they're not so-called, they are called that in INFCIRC 153 itself. And this was the idea that you didn't go around to inspected facilities to a fare thee well, but you concentrated your activity at certain strategic points where it was easiest to measure the material, to observe the material, and so forth. This didn't bother us, as long as it was to the extent that it could be done. Secondly, they made it clear that they want us to demonstrate that we would accept the same inconveniences as they saw them, that they were being asked to accept, and we volunteered to put our entire peaceful nuclear activities under IAEA safeguards to make them subject to. And that was a dramatic event. There was a talk given from, the talk I think originated in Washington, but it was routed through Argonne Laboratory in Chicago. It was on the anniversary date, the 25th anniversary, as I recall it, of the Fermi, of the startup of the Fermi reactor. and Johnson spoke by the first transmission of a communication from the U.S. to Europe by satellite to Italy because of Fermi's role in designing and starting up the reactor. And that was a sine qua non to bring Germany. Those two items were a sine qua non to bring Germany into the NPT. And rightly or wrongly, German adherence to the treaty was considered an essential element. In those days, it was not that long after the war. There was no thought at all that it would be acceptable for Germany to stay out of a non-proliferation treaty. Their adherence was essential, but they weren't a member of the negotiating committee. The NPT was negotiated in Geneva by an 18-nation commission called the 18-Nation Disarmament Commission, and Germany was not a member of it. So there was a little subsidiary negotiation taking place here, mostly in Washington, but partly in Bonn, that got into the treaty, and you'll find it there, the words that the Germans felt were critical, that strategic points would be included in the safeguards agreement. It didn't mention the voluntary agreement because that was the voluntary offer, because that was an arrangement between us and Germany, but as I indicated, we came through with our dramatic voluntary offer by satellite. Oh, I'm going to stop at that point. There are many other things. I'll just say a word or two about what we've accomplished. I believe that the Atoms for Peace program has delivered on what we expected of it. I think that the general concept of offering atomic energy assistance and materials in exchange for controls has worked. I don't think there's a chance in the world that we have what we have today, what I like to refer to as a non-proliferation regime, IAEA safeguards, and of course the NPT. I don't think there's a chance in the world that we would have those without the the Atoms for Peace program having opened the door to them. The old argument that, well, you're teaching these people how to deal with their atomic energy, how to be experts at atomic energy, and not making them you're not making them at the beginning subject to a non-proliferation pledge, simply did not hold water. We have it, and I think we can owe it to the Atoms for Peace program that we do have it. There are several items that I think we ought to be thinking about in the future. One of them is I don't think we should let ourselves be lulled into an attitude that plutonium is no worry anymore, that reactors are no worry. The big problem is enrichment. If you look at the history of proliferation, not of non-proliferation, most of the 9 countries that have nuclear weapons have had their first nuclear explosive was plutonium. It wasn't enriched uranium. Of course, things can change. Enrichment technology has changed, and it's a lot easier today than it used to be. But the plutonium is still, as we find in North Korea, as maybe Syria was on the road to, we can't allow ourselves to be lulled into a state of carelessness about the possibilities of plutonium. Reactors can be hidden. There's no doubt in my mind that you can build clandestine reactors. Just as we've found, you can build clandestine enrichment plants. Reprocessing is duck soup compared to enrichment and can easily be hidden. So we have to worry about plutonium. One of the items that I think we need to look at in the future is the agency's right to undertake special inspections. That's a right that is parallel to the rights of the additional protocol. It's been there from the start of NPT safeguards. It's been allowed to fall into disuse. and that is a serious mistake. It may be the first line of defense against what we now know to be the principal proliferation risk, which is undeclared facilities. The rights that appear in the additional protocol are all to the good. The additional protocol is a desirable addition to the agency's tools, but it's a big, I think, a big mistake to say that it's essential, because when you do that, you're denigrating the rights that you already have, and those may be the most convenient, the best rights to use, the rights of special inspection in going after these undeclared facilities that we now know to be the principal proliferation risk. A minute ago, okay, I'll dispense with it, was a I hope that's legible because it's important, at least in my mind. This is the decision of the board around, well, the year is up there, 1992, about the right of the agency to inspect all of the nuclear material in a state that is a party to the NPT, and to do it using all of the agency's rights and obligations. And what they were talking about were special inspections. That has not been, by and large, followed by the IAEA. It's fallen into disuse. The JCPOA explicitly endorses both the comprehensive safeguards agreements and the additional protocol as among the tools to be used in making sure that Iran complies with its obligations. And I think as we go ahead, if we have occasion to look for undeclared activities in Iran, and of course the best solution would be you don't use either one because you have no feeling or suspicion that they exist. But if you do have to do it, then I think serious consideration should be given to reinvigorating the right of special inspections to make use of it under the JCPOA or wherever the suspicion arises that an undeclared facility is in being, or very importantly, under preparation. We don't want to just go after the completed ones where nuclear material is present. We want to go after them as early as possible. And the role of special inspections in doing that is paramount and should be revived. Well, I'll stop at that point. I apologize for my length.
Thank you, Byron. Our final speaker in this panel is Daniel Poneman, President and Chief Executive Officer of Centrus Energy Corporation. He served as Deputy Secretary of Energy from 2009 to 2014. From 1990 through 1996, he served at the National Security Council as Director for Defense Policy and Arms Control, and then as Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Nonproliferation and Export Controls. Dan has also advised corporate climates as a principal at the Scowcroft Group and spent 8 years practicing law at Hogan and Hartson in Covington and Burling. He's a senior fellow at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard, a distinguished fellow at the Paulson Institute, and a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Dan.
Thank you, Joe, and I'd like to start by thanking the Wilson Center for sponsoring this forum. Rob Litvak and you, Joe, have had a very strong collaboration for all these years, and Los Alamos National Laboratory, I think we owe a debt of gratitude, not just for this session, but I know that you have done a lot of oral histories. Some of the people who have given those oral histories, I think, are no longer among us, and I think it's really a public service. And if you needed any proof positive of that fact, I think the session we've had here this morning is that proof. I had a chance last night to talk to Myron Kratzer, who I first met in June 1975, and I discovered, you know, he was already a crusty veteran at that point. I was 1 week into my internship working for John Glenn, trying to figure out what the letters NPT stood for. And Myron helped me understand that. I found out last night he actually started in this business in 1944 for the United States government. And then that was when I was a summer intern for John Glenn, when I was a summer intern in the unlamented office in the State Department that was the runt of the litter of the mid-'70s, the Political Military Bureau's Non-Proliferation Policy Office, which was, you know, trying to get some headroom between Gerard C. Smith, who was the special ambassador, and Tom Pickering, who was the assistant secretary with OES and had all the real authority. And then there was this young whippersnapper, Joe Nye, who was working up in T and so forth. And so we were a very benighted little organization, but who showed me a real kindness at that time. He may not even remember us. An evening we had a beautiful dinner in Lake Barcroft with Jim Goodby, and so he is really a young whippersnapper compared to Myron, because he didn't get going in this until 1951. So if you take the three of us, that's 140 years, because I started in 1975, and if you add the real runt of the litter, Joe Pilot, he didn't get going until 1981. That adds up to 217 years. So if you go back 217 years, John Adams was president. Okay, just to give you some.
Good old days, huh?
And I'll tell you, I'm sitting here taking copious notes. There is so much content in what we heard from Myron and Jim, and so much we have to learn. But I have to say, I am struck with a sort of sense of poignance about a lot of what I hear, because the leadership that these gentlemen embody, both in terms of what the United States was in the nuclear world and what we meant, really cannot be exaggerated. So if Myron can figure out how to use this clicker, I can. Joe asked me to just reflect on some experiences I had had vis-a-vis the IAEA. Do not have anything like the depth that either of our colleagues do, but I will also end quickly, because I know the really interesting part to come will be when we get some Q&A going. So I think of this in terms of my experiences with the IAEA really as a sort of a coming of age story for the IAEA, not really for me. And let's see if this thing works. Is that, that's a laser beam. Oh, that works. Okay. This shows you that I have a day job. You can forget about that. Okay. So I'm sorry, I couldn't avoid it. We have to start where everyone starts. And I'll tell you something, I think probably everyone in this room has read this speech over and over again. And you know what? I read it again for this. It really stands up well. I have to say, and the insights we got from our earlier speakers, when Ike said, the dread, secret, and fearful engines of atomic might are not ours alone. And he went on to say, in contemplating the prospect of nuclear war, that to stop there, in other words, accepting the possibility of nuclear annihilation, would be to accept helplessly the probability of civilization destroyed, the annihilation of the irreplaceable heritage of mankind handed down to us from generation to generation, and the condemnation of mankind to begin all over again the age-old struggle upward from savagery toward decency and right and justice. Surely no sane member of the human race could discover victory in such desolation. These are the words of somebody who had experienced war and who had the vision, and I agree with Myron, it's probably the flagstone of his tenure. And it's actually prescient in the sense he's already talking about a fuel bank. So here we are, you know, August 29th, 2017, we had the inauguration. Laura Holgate, thank you, and NTI for all the great leadership that led to that. And the vision was there. And I will give my neck a strain if I read more from this, but you can see where, you know, the deal that Myron ended up his talk saying, that deal, I totally agree with Myron. That was the predicate. You can't have one without the other. I, for years, was one of those people who said, I don't care about, what was these pictures of, like, avocados that are bigger. You know, So much of the IAEA publications bored me, but you know what? And we heard Amano-san talking earlier today. It really is critical to the credibility. It really is critical to making this the kind of a deal that any self-respecting nation will adhere to. So, in this respect, you know, we've gone through a number of years of discussions about what organizations like the IAEA mean and do vis-a-vis the U.S., and we heard, again, echoes of this in our earlier speakers' remarks about, are we really diluting American influence, or is it an extension thereof? And I think my experience in particular times where I've run into the IAEA, which had to do with Iraq, had to do with North Korea, had to do with Iran, I found that, in fact, you know, the desire to sort of hold this thing as a bilateral U.S.-driven agenda in which we would unilaterally impose our nonproliferation preferences through our own bilateral channels was inadequate, because we do not have enough authority to impose that kind of outcome around the world. We can do many things, but we cannot do everything. And as again was said earlier today, it was pretty early on that we were no longer the alpha and the omega when it came to things nuclear. And if we didn't have the cooperation of other countries and governments that had the means to exercise their will and to support us or not, then it would not have mattered. And if we didn't have an entity that had some credibility for independence and detachment, which the IAEA did over time achieve, I do not think we could have had the credibility to sustain the international support that in any really tough case you're going to need. You're going to need UN Security Council resolutions. And so, to me, to my way of thinking, you know, the way we thought and the wise men that Walter Isaacson wrote about as having created the post-World World War II institutions of the IMF and the Atlantic Treaty, etc., those things, I think, did not limit and confine, but rather extended the reach of American influence. And so I think that the IAEA is very much part of that heritage, and I think its success is critically dependent on maintaining that kind of ecumenical status. So because this is a non-proliferation meeting, we have to do the Kennedy quote, but the only reason to put it here now is because I now have learned this morning that the multilateral force was in fact did not become a reality through a lot of very important diplomatic efforts engaged with Germany, when all these years I've been thinking it was Tom Lehrer's song called the MLF Lullaby, which I thought was the coup de grace for that particular idea. So we'll just move right along. So speaking of coming of age, you know, Joe asked for recollections. My first week at the National Security Council, I read a press report that there was, and I can talk about this because it was in the press by definition, there was an intelligence assessment about Iraq's nuclear weapons capabilities. So this would be August-ish 1990, maybe September. And I thought, that's pretty interesting. So I called over to the people who wrote that stuff, and I said, yeah, can I see that too? I'm like at the White House, National Security Council. I go, no, you can't see that. I said, well, why does the news? It didn't matter. The interesting point to make in this session is that, you know, in the years leading up to Saddam Hussein's invasion, a lot of stuff got missed, right? And the question presented at that point was, the IAEA institutionally was in agreement with the nation state being inspected and so forth, and was not given sort of the run of the places to check out, and did not, I think, have the right probably cultural approach to the issue as well. But when a country, you know, on August 2nd, 1990, overruns its neighbor, you know, you might think, well, if they're willing to just kind of flout international law and crush their neighbor and take over its sovereignty, maybe their attachment to IAEA safeguards obligations isn't absolute. And so after the war ended, and this part is where my own memory starts to kick in, there was a bit of a struggle, frankly, a bureaucratic struggle between the setting of this special commission, which became known as UNSCOM, and the IAEA as to who would have responsibility over the inspections that were going to verify and hopefully roll back Iraq's nuclear efforts. And as you all know, there came to be some kind of a compromise in which I think, it's an interesting question always to me, how much broad institutional and historical trends make a difference in history and how much depends on sort of particular personalities. And I think it's hard to think of that period without thinking of people like David Kaye, who was doing the work for the IAEA, and Bob Gallucci, and Ralph Fakeas over at UNSCOM. But I think, a couple of things happened, and I think, oh yeah, there's the picture. I do remember, quite early on, there was, I think, kind of a transformation when David Kaye basically caught the Iraqis trying to sort of move Caleutrons like one step ahead of the posse and stop them from being viewed. I think so that June 1991 inspection, I think, was part of a turning point. And then I think, frankly, the episode, I can still remember very clearly getting the phone call that, Bob Gallucci was trapped in a parking lot, and there was a struggle over an unannounced inspection where they actually managed to get their hands on a bunch of documents which the Iraqis were not eager to see leave the parking lot. And so these kind of standoffs, I think, actually led to a change. And frankly, and we talked a lot in that period to Director General Hans Blix, who would always come by NSC whenever he was in town. And I think it was a searing experience. And I think that there was, I think Jim used the phrase coming of age. I think there was a coming of age for the IAEA in that period where they actually began to take a much more aggressive and I think effective posture vis-a-vis some of these issues. Now, in the meantime, there were things happening on the bilateral front, and the United States was engaged a lot in the diplomacy. This is a little bit of a sidebar, but at the same time, of course, we had the disintegration of the former Soviet Union and the deep concern about what would happen to the weapons that were left there and that were left in the former Soviet socialist republics, including Kazakhstan. And I think that the really historic decision, which I think history will always honor, of President Nazarbayev to close the Semipalatinsk test site, August 29, 1991, give up his nuclear weapons, a very pivotal moment for nonproliferation writ large. And of course, the IAEA had always had a very important role, beginning with the negotiation of the Safeguards Agreement. The U.S. continued to do very important operations. We got 600 kilograms out in Operation Sapphire, and then, many years later, when I was back at Department of Energy, we got 3,000 kilograms of plutonium moved from these big casks over in the Caspian near Aktau over to actually Semi, to the same area. All of that, I think, shows the importance of the cooperation that has gone on, where we have the international imprimatur of an organization like the IAEA. And it's a very interesting thing. The effect of all the atomic weapons tests in Kazakhstan actually has had a profound grassroots effect in that country. And so they actually have a very strong attachment from what I've been able to observe. I spent a lot of time in Kazakhstan with the Kazakhstan colleagues. They really do respect that kind of international imprimatur. And that's why it was very important to them to get this mandate to host this IAEA fuel bank. And I think in terms of, again, achieving a regime in which it is not viewed as a Pax Americana that has imposed Deus Ex Machina on the rest of the world, but to have other contributing members, Kazakhstan, which is home of 40% of the world's uranium resources, I think that's a good thing. And I think what's also a good thing is the fact that the president of Kazakhstan actually very explicitly states that he made a strategic decision to go non-nuclear, and he directly imputes the prosperity that has ensued since 1991, willingness of international oil companies to come in there and sign, to the good citizenship that Kazakhstan has always demonstrated when it comes to things related to nonproliferation. Now, for me, perhaps Oh, and by the way, wait, go back on a second. 'Cause how'd that go? Yeah. So again, Joe asked me for personal reminiscence. So here's an Amano-san story. So there had been this big conference in Astana. This was the 20th anniversary of the closing of Semipalatinsk. This is August 29, 2011. And then we all got on planes and helicopters, and we flew out to Semi. And this is the monument. You can't see the whole monument. This is the monument where they made a statue to the victims who had suffered ill effects from all the 460 nuclear weapons tests. All by way of saying is, I happened to be on the same helicopter with Amano-san and the Foreign Minister Kazikhanov, who's now the ambassador here in Washington, and that's the governor of the Oblast, Saparbayev, to the left. So I never really knew what it's like to be Madonna. I mean, the performer. But when we got off this helicopter, I don't know where they found these people, but you know those cameras with the huge telephoto lens you usually see in Africa and sporting events? So they glommed onto Amano-san like he was Madonna, and they're actually trying to run backwards as we are approaching this brand new museum at Semi, which had pictures of like half the people in this audience in there. So that was quite a day. We went to the layer cake test site that day. Every place we went, we were invited into a ger, which some people call a yurt, and every yurt was, up to the gills in vodka. So let's just say I remember the beginning of the day better than the end of the day. I was not supposed to have a speaking role. We're on top of a big set of stairs here. I don't know if anybody was there that day, but they were like every man, woman, and child in the Oblast, every pensioner, every student, every factory worker, they were all let off work. Kids were in school uniforms, flags were waving, balloons were flying. I, of course, was a mere deputy secretary, so I had no speaking role. I just had to turn up. So it's one of those things, the crowd parts, you go up the set of stairs with all these eminences, and then I'm standing there, I'm enjoying the speeches. And then I hear, something, something Russian, then Poneman. And then nobody's talking, and then they're looking at me, and I go, I guess that's my cue. But I don't have, where's my talking points? So I get up there. I'm remembering like those two like Elvis Presley like microphones that Evita used to use, and I just winged it, and it felt great. I live this stuff, Nazarbayev, historic decision, prosperity. What I just said 5 minutes ago, and they were cheering wildly, and the balloons were flying, and the flags were waving, and I'm thinking like Mussolini knew what he was doing because this was like fun. I was enjoying myself. And when I'm finished, there was a huge, roar. And then I realized there was no translation. So, there's only, 5 people even knew what I said. But they were, they must have got the card. And the guys with the bullets and the old Cossack ones, they were there too. Anyway, so that was my anecdote. So, now this was a real experience. I don't know why you picked that picture, but Myron was talking a little bit ago about not giving up important kinds of inspection rights and not making it seem like you have to have the additional protocol because it sort of denigrates the inspection regime as it's legally constituted. And I agree with him. I agree with him on that. And at the time of the North Korean crisis, and this I really think showed a lot of good work by governments and by the IAEA. And it's very interesting because having been seared by the Iraq experience and getting really, really tough, and actually being leaned on by the U.S. government to get tougher, in this particular instance, the U.S. government was in some ways trying to encourage the IAEA to show some flexibility because we're in the middle of a very fragile diplomatic effort, which at such time as basically the IAEA would pull the plug in the form of declaring North Korea to be out of compliance, it could precipitate, a real crisis, including a military crisis. And so I just wanted to note in this coming of age theme that I actually started working on this issue the first day on the job working for President Bush 41 at the National Security Council, and it was through the good work of the IAEA that I think the North Koreans were pretty surprised that when they made their initial declaration after they joined the NPT, that they got busted, that we found these, that they were exposed to anomalies in the accounting of what was seen and what was reported and so forth, and that gave rise to this request for a special inspection in February 1993, which precipitated March 12th, 1993, announcement by the North Koreans that they were going to pull out of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and it precipitated a year and a half of very intense diplomacy, which led to the agreed framework in October 1994. So, my recollection, and I would so defer to the expertise of my betters here, is that there are regular inspections, there are ad hoc inspections, there are special inspections, but I think at that time there was no formal thingy called a continuity of safeguards inspection. There is a notion of continuity of safeguards, but my recollection was that Blix kind of came up with this notion of a continuity of safeguards inspection, which, given the fact that the North Koreans were not willing to give full unfettered access, which they're supposed to do, was like the next best thing, and at least allow the IAEA to get in there, make sure the batteries were running the cameras and stuff like that, so that they could at least verify that the mechanisms in place remain in place. Because remember, we had like 8,000 spent fuel rods with about 35 kilograms of plutonium at Yongbyon. So, and that was a very tricky, delicate period, and I do give a lot of credit to the IAEA and to Blix for having managed that very well. The situation heated up a lot in the beginning of '94. The North Koreans kind of subtly threatened to engulf Seoul in a sea of fire. That definitely got people's attention. And then, having worked so hard to sustain this tissue of connectivity between the IAEA and the North Koreans, then the North Koreans went ahead and they defueled their 5-megawatt reactor in a way that we could not keep track of. And I remember Gallucci said they destroyed history, and Blix basically called the question. And again, one personal anecdote, I think it might be in our book that I wrote about. In June, like June 10th, the IAEA, I think, suspended cooperation with North Korea, and terminated they had actually some modest technical assistance still going. And I happened to be in the Oval Office with President Clinton, and he was not pleased. And I remember he said something which I think is a good lesson even today, just in situations of this character. He said, I understand, and I explained it to him. I said that, really the IAEA had no choice. And he said, I understand imposing pressure, but once you impose a pressure, you got to give them somewhere to go. And I didn't exactly plan, in fact, nobody except him planned the Carter intervention, but Deus Ex Machina, Carter's intervention, ultimately gave the North Koreans somewhere to go. So that, we could talk more about that in the Q&A. My next intensive involvement, I had just been at the Department of Energy for a few months. As many of you in the audience know, the job of a Deputy Secretary of Energy, you do sit on the Deputies Committee, but you're really supposed to be running the department and loan guarantees and carbon capture and grid resilience, all that kind of stuff. And I actually heard from foreigners before I heard from my own government, so I'm going to see you in Vienna. And I'm thinking, like, have I missed the memo or what? I have no idea. I actually heard, including from the Russians first. And it was an NTI dinner, as a matter of fact. Then I got a call from the Undersecretary of State at the time, Bill Burns, and he says, well, I think we're going to ask you to go to Vienna, and I wanted you to hear from me first. I said, too late. And I said, why? Oh, then, I'm sorry, it was followed up by a call from the Deputy National Security Advisor, Tom Donilon, and he said, we need you to go to Vienna. And I said, why? I said, why don't you send Deputy Secretary of State Jim Steinberg or Undersecretary of State Bill Burns? They said, because this is supposed to be a technical discussion, that there's a defueling situation with the Tehran research reactor, one of these 20% reactors, Myron. And so I was sent off to Vienna to negotiate with the Iranians and others on this. This has not been actually very much reported. I found out only years later that the DOE press office never let me talk to anybody about this. But in any event, it's an interesting footnote, not about the U.S. per se, but really more about the IAEA. When we got there, this was like 3 weeks before Al-Baradei was retiring. And the parties in the talk were the French, the Iranians, the U.S., and the Russians. And at the beginning of the session, and the theory of the negotiation was that we were going to use the need for medical radioisotopes that were produced by this Tehran research reactor as the sort of diplomatic basis upon which to extract the LEU that by that time Iran had accumulated. It was a pretty good idea. And the Iranians had showed some inclination to perhaps be willing to consider this. So that was my mandate. I had a great team over there. But Al-Baradei's initial posture in these meetings was sort of above the fray, we're the IAEA, we have to be neutral arbiters, etc. So very quickly, the French offered to supply the new fuel to the Tehran research reactor. This led to a speech by the Iranians about Eurodif and how they were not happy that their shares were not honored, blah, blah, blah. This led then the Russians to stand up. It was Nikolai Spassky, who's been a great non-proliferation partner on a number of issues, to say they would backstop the French pledge. And then, to his credit, Al-Baradei said, and the IAEA would backstop the Russians backstopping the French. Bottom line, gave the Iranians nowhere to go, and actually we got in what the diplomats call an ad ref agreement to do this deal and extract all this LEU. The deal fell apart. We can answer questions if we have time left. In Tehran, everyone lifted their ad ref, they say, except the Iranians. The French, the Russians, the U.S. all approved. It didn't go. But I do think, again, this shows to me the coming of age of the IAEA. I thought that was a very constructive role, and I do honor the role that they're playing on the JCPOA. I think it's fundamentally important, and I could not improve on what the Director General said this morning. So I will close by just drawing some of the same lessons, and I think, again, this will resonate with what my earlier colleagues said. I personally believe, I think Myron was right, the non-proliferation regime could not have happened as it did without the Atoms for Peace vision, and the IAEA is the instrumentality in so many ways of that vision. I do think the duality that we all talk about and obsess about is as valid today as it was at the beginning. We face tremendous opportunities for the good that atomic fission can help produce, but obviously catastrophic risks. And nuclear is pivotal to addressing these issues. IAEA is pivotal to the success in performing the mission that I think lies before us as members of the human race. And I think people like the people assembled here who have dedicated decades, collectively centuries, to this task, really, we have an opportunity now to push this thing forward. And I think it's more than an opportunity. I think it's a responsibility. And I close where I started, thanking Joe, thanking Wilson Center, Los Alamos for a really fascinating morning.
Thank you, Dan. I'd like to start off, we do have some time for Q&A. I would like to start off by asking the panelists if they had any questions or comments to each other.
I would not want to preempt.
No? So we'll go Trevor first.
Thank you very much. And Trevor Finlay from Melbourne University. Thank you all to the panellists. That was terrific. Dan, you mentioned the word culture when you were talking about Iraq and the safeguard system prior to Iraq. Could you say whether you think a different culture would have made any difference in that outcome of detecting Iraq's non-compliance prior to the system being improved, obviously? And Myron, could I ask you your thoughts on why you think the special inspections arrangement fell into disuse? Why did the agency not pursue the use of special inspections to the point where it's become too much of a political hot potato to really carry out? Thank you very much.
I think given the time, let's collect three
Okay.
questions
Okay.
and then go. Leopoldo.
Hi, I'm Leopoldo Nuti, Roma Tre University. I have about 1,000 questions, but thank you very much, gentlemen. This has been fascinating. I have a very specific one for our Ambassador Goodby. About the time you were in Brussels, at the American delegation at the European Community, this is the time, more or less, when the Europeans set up both Eurenco and Eurodiv, and I would like to know what was the American attitude at the time towards this initiative. Was this seen more as an opportunity to keep things under control, as these were multilateral initiatives, or was this seen as a threat because there would be more enrichment facilities developed outside of the US control?
Right here, Michael.
Thank you. Thanks to the panelists. Michael Rosenthal. I'd like to ask Ambassador Goodby, how did it happen that the article that you and Myron referred to, 12C in the, or some number in the statute, gave the agency such extraordinary, on their face, inspection powers, anytime, anywhere, any place, to any person? Was that difficult to negotiate, or what were the circumstances that surrounded it? And I learned from Myron that it was never realized even early in the U.S. days. And for Myron, a question. I know during the negotiation of the NPT, proposals to limit the agency's role to just declared material were rejected. And yet, in the Secretariat, or in the Inspectorate, there developed a very strongly held view, widely, that the agency's role was limited to just declared material. And I wonder if you have any insight into how that developed within the Secretariat. Thank you.
Please. Why don't you begin, Ambassador Goodby?
Well, I defer to Myron on the 12C issue, but let me speak about the Eurodiff and Eurenco issues. You have to remember that during those years, and basically ever since the end of World War II, the United States was very, very supportive of the idea of a European community. It was seen as a bulwark against Soviet domination of Western Europe. It was basically an idea that had much support simply because of relationships that many people in Washington had with Jean Monnet, Robert Schuman, and it was just a part of our DNA in a way. I mean, this is something, United States of Europe and all that. So that whatever the Europeans wanted to do, that was multilateral, there was almost automatically a very, very strong lobby in Washington to let it happen. And that is the way, my recollection is that is the way it happened. There wasn't very much debate about that, I don't believe. I was, of course, in Brussels then and not aware of exactly what was going on in Washington, D.C., but I think that would be probably the right answer to you.
Myron.
Well, which question do you am I answering?
As many as you wish to answer.
Okay, well, I'll comment briefly on the Euratom thing that Jim has already covered very well. Euratom, as I said earlier, it was very, very special. And a good part of the reason was that there was a very powerful group in the European Bureau of the State Department who thought that European integration, and Euratom was part of it, European Atomic Energy Community, that European integration was the most important thing since sliced bread, that it was going to bring, and let's be specific about it, France and Germany together in an organization that had real clout. And this was intended, and I think has worked out to be a bulwark against the attitudes that led to world wars and a lot of smaller ones in Europe in the last century. So there was no, as Jim said, really no contest that Euratom deserved special attention in terms of atomic energy, that the grant of Safeguards Authority to it was not wrong because they were a genuine multinational, or as they called it, supranational organization in which the parties or members had bona fide diversity of interests against each of them having nuclear weapons. So that's what started it. Now, the other question about how we got into the situation of essentially allowing the special inspections to fall into disuse, I'd love to have the answer to it. I think a lot of it was a misguided but probably genuine belief that that authority didn't exist, although to reach that conclusion you have to disregard the clear-cut words of the NPT and INFCIRC 153, which are based on it, which say all nuclear material is subject. Makes no distinction whatsoever between that which is declared and that which isn't. Some of you know of the existence and perhaps have looked at a detailed negotiating history of the NPT, of INFCIRC 153, in which it was pointed out that the very first item in the draft safeguard document that was presented to the Safeguards Committee, the subcommittee of the Board of Governors of the IAEA, the very first member state intervention was a proposal to limit it. I think they called it not declared but reported, but the meaning was the same, to limit the NPT safeguards to reported activities. And that was defeated instantly. And how it came about in the course of 10 years, as I measure it, we moved from the distinction of everyone understanding clearly that that authority was there to a situation where at the end of 10 years, a U.S. inspector could come before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and testify that he didn't believe there was any such authority is beyond me. It was partially personal on the part of certain inspectors, maybe all of them. There may have been member state interventions, not public, but privately conveyed to the DG and others that that's the way they wanted it. And of course, the real problem is that there was no defense. No one was up front saying it can't be this way. That's all I can tell you. That's all I can say.
12C.
Is there more?
12C.
Well, I don't know how 12C came about. You remember Al Wells, I'm sure. Yeah. He was a participant as a lawyer. He was my first boss in international affairs in the Atomic Energy Commission. He contended that those very troublesome words, to the extent relevant to the project or arrangement, which somewhat qualified the very dramatic formulation of Article 12, did not mean that you could cut down access at all times to access, well, some of the time, that they only meant that it was relevant all or nothing. In other words, that there might be arrangements to develop radioisotopes to kill fruit flies, and that it wouldn't be relevant. So you wouldn't have inspectors going in to observe radiation's effect on fruit flies. That it never was intended to allow member states to say, well, you don't have access at all times. You only have access at some times. And yet, that's what happened. In the very first formulation of safeguards, drawn incidentally very heavily from the U.S. system of material accountancy, not really full inspection, but material accountancy, they came up with a formula that said if the reactor is so many megawatts, you can go so many times. If the reactor is twice that number of megawatts, you can go twice as many times a year. The first meeting of safeguards that I attended in Vienna, there was a safeguard committee was looking at the next step, larger reactors, larger than 100 megawatts. And we had advanced knowledge, such as it goes, that the Soviet Union was going to support a more forthcoming event, a more forthcoming formulation. And we went there and determined to get access at all times for reactors above 100 megawatts, to go back to what the statute said. And I was, to say that I was naive was putting it mildly. I didn't realize that the agency had essentially developed a process of consensus decision-making in its board meetings and meetings of the subsidiary committees. And after quite a long discussion, it took us through dinner time, I told the chairman of this committee that we wanted a vote. And he looked at me like I was crazy, but they took a vote. And the agency did approve, that committee approved, and it was subsequently approved by the board. And it's found in IMCIRC 26, add 1, which is a ridiculous formulation, that for reactors above 100 megawatts thermal, the agency did in fact have access at all times. And when I came back, I was called on to report to Jerry Smith, whom I barely knew, and he was then assistant to the secretary for atomic energy. And he asked one question: did we get access at all times? And we did. And there were a lot of little breakthroughs that gradually, at a subsequent safeguard committee meeting, we got the next thing that we wanted very badly, which was continuous inspection. I don't know whether the agency has really implemented continuous inspection at some large reprocessing and maybe enrichment plants, but to our view at the time, and still today in my view, there's only when you have really difficult safeguard targets, very complex bulk handling facilities, you've got to have people there, inspectors there, all the time. So the answer is that there's always an element of resistance to more, to tougher safeguards, but the statute gives you a lot of support for getting very effective ones, and gradually that has happened.
I'll just answer very quickly. Would the cultural shift that I detected in the IAEA post-Iraq have detected it had it existed earlier? I would say that would be a necessary but not sufficient condition, because you would need a cultural shift in Saddam Hussein, which I think is probably not a super high prospect, which is probably the underlying premise to your question. However, the qualification I would make to the answer is a cultural shift even on the part of the IAEA that would have made them more aggressive in trying to smoke out and detect stuff would have created a lot of questions that the Iraqis would have either had to stonewall or comply with. They probably would have stonewalled, and then that would have created an issue. And so, I mean, I think it's sort of a bank shot, and it's not sufficient. But I would say, by the same token, something I've advocated for like a dozen years after the first Iraq War, in an article I published with then Professor Moniz and John Deutsch and my dear friend and departed colleague Arnold Cantor, an assured nuclear fuel services initiative, if you put it in place today, is part of the answer to people who say after the JCPOA runs out, there's nothing to stop Iran from a breakneck program to create a large commercial enrichment capacity, because if you actually were able to address what any reasonable person would interpret as a genuine need, then you take away the genuine justification for a very aggressive deployment of centrifuges by Iran post-JCPOA, and then that arms the international community with a set of arguments and a basis for imposing sharper scrutiny and skepticism. So I think, you know, you need, for the culture thing to work everywhere, it has to be pervasive, but I think if you get it anywhere, it can help create options for you that will help reduce your risk.
We're unfortunately out of time. What I'd like to do is to break now for lunch, return back to schedule at 1:45 for the panel 2 on safeguards. But please join me in thanking the panelists